Hello guys, welcome back to Not Just Makeup, it's Marco here, and today we talk about ice and water effects for your bases. Last year I spent a lot of time studying and making experiments with clear resin and various water effects. I made something like 15 bases with ice and water in different conditions, and I came up with some cool tricks. Now I'm tinkering with an interesting idea for the bases of my handmade from Warcry, and a few things that I want to use on a big display model, and this is the perfect opportunity to record everything. Don't forget to subscribe, hit the bell button and check the links down below in the description. And if you want to support the channel and my work, check my Patreon page and its rewards. Thanks a million guys!
The idea is to create a layer of cracking ice on top of a deep pool of water. It's always hard to create a believable ice effect, but combining it with water, we can play with different finishes and textures that will help to sell better the image and the idea of ice. I plan to transfer this same approach to a display model, but I want it to work well also on a gaming base, so it has to be quick and simple. The base needs to be light and thin, maintaining the standard height of a gaming base. The ice is the focus of the scene, so the lateral effect isn't really important in this situation, and it will show only a small amount of details. I fixed the 30mm base on an old plinth using a piece of Butyl. If you don't know what Butyl is, check my video about building a 75mm model for all the details. Just move it a bit to reactivate its natural stickiness with the heat of your fingers. I start adding the first tones of the water that will be visible in transparency through the layer of ice. I start with the light tone, Molotov Lagoon Blue. This is at the same time primer and first layer. Followed by Molotov Turquoise, that's almost the same tone but darker, starting to work only the outer rim of the base. Then a layer of True Blue to create contrast with the green tones, but keeping everything in the spectrum of cold tones. Here I start reducing even more the area of application to start building an effect of fake depth. And I close this first step with a dark petrol blue, hitting almost only the rim of the base and the lower part of the lateral profile. Then I reinforce the effect with turquoise ink, adding more depth thanks to its higher saturation and glossy finish. And the final pass with indigo blue, that with this touch of purple will create more contrast and will make the lowest parts of the base almost black and super shiny. And here we have the perfect base for our base. And it's time for the fun part, ice. To create the layer of ice, I'll use this leftover piece of transparent plastic. I tend to collect this kind of useful materials every time I can, and this in particular comes from an old IKEA frame. I trace the shape of the base with a sharpie, and I cut it with a pair of curved scissors. This kind of plastic doesn't like to be cut in this way and produces irregular shapes and cracks around the edges that tend to become white and matte, but this is precisely the first trick to create a believable ice. I'll need only 3 of these to create the right thickness for my ice, but you know, it's always better to have a backup. Time to break the ice. It's really easy to break this thin plastic with your fingers, but be careful. It's almost impossible to produce a sharp edge, but you never know. I try to produce irregular cracks that converge in the center of the disc. This will be the break point for all the 3 layers that later will be overlapped one on top of the other to create a thick irregular layer with a very interesting profile. Now that I have all the sharp blocks of ice, it's time to recompose the puzzle. I drew the shape of the base on a piece of paper and prepared 2 loops of adhesive tape to keep the first layer in place. I simply transfer the bigger and less interesting shapes onto the tape to create the foundations. I don't want a single round piece, but I'm trying to create 4 or 5 thick main elements so they'll be able to move and adapt naturally on top of the layer of water. I'm gluing everything with simple super glue without particular care to the aesthetic in this stage. All my efforts are in creating an interesting overlap of irregular shapes. The dry glue will create new interesting patterns between the layers, with a very icy look, and even if now everything seems opaque, almost white, it will regain its natural transparency in the later steps thanks to the shiny transparent resin. You can see how the various parts are free to move, and this will create a more natural effect and will give me the chance to move and adapt better the shards on the base. And here is the result. I ended up with 4 main shapes with a nice breaking point in the middle, with all the little cracks converging in the center. When they'll be on the base, will be impossible to understand that they are only 4 pieces. Time for the water. I have this product for water effects from AK Interactive, but you can use any brand you prefer. They are all clear epoxy resin with similar chemical and physical properties. And here are all the ingredients and tools. The main bottle of resin and the hardener agent, a couple of syringes to precisely dose the components, an expandable cap and something to stir well the mix. I have also an oil color to add a bit of tone to the transparent water and increase its depth. The recipe for the AK water is 2 parts resin and 1 part hardener agent. I always prepare a bit more of what I really need to have some leftovers where I can check the resin without touching the base. It's vital to mix well the 2 components. If the chemical reaction is unbalanced, it can create milky inclusions while drying and your work will be completely ruined. This resin takes 24 hours to dry, so I don't have to rush and I can take my time. At this stage I can add a microscopic drop of paint. I want the water to have a bluish-greenish tone, but it has to be transparent, so this tiny drop will be more than enough. There's always time to add more paint, but you can't do the contrary. Epoxy resin doesn't like water, so you need to use solvent-based paints like enamels or oils, or simple pigments to avoid any problem with different mediums. For this work I have a set of rubber molds from Green Stuff World. These come in all the possible shapes and measures, and they are super handy to work with resin. Sadly, the edge is very low and you are limited to thin gaming bases, but is more than enough for this work. With the base inside the mold, I can gently pour the mix. This prevents the mix to incorporate extra air and transform your water in sparkling water. I don't mind to have few bubbles, especially if I'm creating an action scene, but I don't want my eyes to float on a lake of soda. You can remove most of the bubbles touching them with a toothpick, using the heat of a lighter or the hairdryer. Waiting for the resin to gain some density, you can clean all your tools using methylated spirit, that will completely dissolve any residue. I use the leftover resin in the mixing cup to keep under control its consistency. After half an hour, the density of the resin is perfect to sustain the weight of the ice. It's still totally playable, but its surface tension can already support the plastic. As you can see, the resin will fill the gaps between the layers, bringing back the natural transparency of the plastic. Now we need only to wait. The resin dries completely in 24 hours, but if you are like me in a hurry and curious to see the result, you can remove the base from the mold after a night. At the last minute, I added a zombie arm coming out from the water to create a little story. This used to be a scary part where you always find imperfection and stuff to fix, but with the silicone mold everything is much easier. Sadly, the mold has a fine texture and is not completely smooth, so the resin will have this kind of matte finish, but it's very easy to polish the surface and bring back the transparency. In my case, this kind of finish is perfect to hide crimes, to blend the edges of the plastic base, to give the idea of ice and to drive all the attention on the upper part. I quickly paint the arm using contrast paints, matching the cold tones of the scene. To enhance the look of the eyes, I use white ink in the airbrush to spray with a low pressure the parts that are outside the resin water. This will give a frosty look to the eyes, creating more contrast and a different finish between the parts inside and outside water. Same thing on the lateral edge, to further blend and hide the harsh edges of the base, leaving in transparency the nice texture of the layer of ice. You can use a Q-tip to erase the overspray. The shiny glossy resin is super easy to clean with pure water. Using the same white ink, straight from the bottle, I edge highlight the blocks of ice to increase the definition. I enhance the look of every little interesting crack, and I create new cuts and little details. The ice is ready, but the hand in the middle is a bit sad. It seems like the creature is just slowly going down and drawing. To make the scene more dynamic, I need splashes, ripples and extra movement in the external layer of water. I use small segments of fishing line to create the structure for the splashes of water. A little drop of super glue will keep everything in place. Then I mix some epoxy glue on a piece of baking paper, adding a pinch of oil color to tie the effect with the tones of the base. With an old brush, I put drops of epoxy on the fishing line, creating little exploding drops of water. Epoxy glue is extremely dense, and it will easily stay in place, creating perfect drops that will become super hard and still a bit elastic, so perfect to resist to all the stress of a gaming base. Using the same epoxy glue, I add little shards of ice to the end of the fishing line to create the idea of a sudden explosion of water and ice caused by the appearance of the zombie. At the end, I use Vallejo water gel to better hide all the junction points around the arm and to create smaller splashes and ripples all around. Don't worry, everything will become transparent and glossy after a few hours. This product is very dense, and you can literally sculpt the shapes you want and add new layers over the first pass. I'm pretty satisfied with the result of this experiment. The ice is very realistic, even with the saturated fantasy tones of the base, and the same effect can be easily used for historical models and realistic dioramas. The base is super solid and the thickness is perfect for a gaming base, with all the important details on the upper part where can be easily seen from the point of view of the players. The effect will work even better on a larger surface, where all the shapes and the different textures of ice and water can create more complex and various patterns. But on a display base, I would definitely prefer a deeper layer of water to add more details and Easter eggs in the transparency of the resin.
If you like this video, give it a like and subscribe. Remember that you can always ask me anything down below with a comment, and you can follow my projects during the week using one of my socials. And if you want to support the channel and my work, check the Patreon page and join the community. See you next week, guys.